Is Jane Foster a variant in Thor Love and Thunder? Folks, now that the Thor Love and Thunder trailer is finally here, the endless array of Thor Love and Thunder theories can finally begin in earnest. And you'd better believe that we are ready to strap on our vibranium foil hats to speculate about what this trailer might be hiding. As for today's theory, it revolves around one of the most anticipated reveals of the entire movie, our first look at Natalie Portman's Jane Foster as the mighty Thor. Fans have been champing at the bit to see Jane Foster prove herself worthy of Mjolnir ever since her return was announced at San Diego Comic-Con. But is the Jane Foster that we see in the Thor Love and Thunder trailer the same one that we remember from the first two Thor films?
She didn't dump me, you know. I dumped her. It's a mutual dumping.
As many of my colleagues and many of you in the comment section were quick to wonder, is Jane Foster actually a variant in Thor Love and Thunder? Well, we're going to break down this theory and all the evidence supporting it in just a moment. However, in order to do so, we need to touch on some spoilers from the comic books and potentially spoilers from the movie itself. So if you're worried about that sort of thing, well, take a page out of Loki's book and go find something fun to do for, say, 30 minutes or so.
I have been falling for 30 minutes!
Don't worry, the video's not actually 30 minutes long. I just needed an excuse to show that clip. All right, let's get into it, shall we? Let's start with what we know to be true from the trailer. Towards the end of the trailer, we see Thor in a fur-lined cape fighting off monsters in what appears to be New Asgard or another city on Earth. Suddenly, Thor finds himself face to face with a familiar face in an unfamiliar outfit and with a weapon he never would have expected, Jane Foster wielding Mjolnir. But not just any Mjolnir, the hammer that Jane is holding appears to be Thor's old hammer, which Hela destroyed seemingly beyond repair in Thor Ragnarok. It looks to be pieced back together in a manner that evokes the Japanese art of kintsugi, but, you know, with magical lightning instead of gold. And while Thor retrieved Mjolnir in Avengers Endgame from another timeline's Asgard in 2013, and the Avengers used it to battle alternate Thanos, Steve Rogers did return Mjolnir and the Infinity Stones to their proper places in the timeline to avoid ripping the multiverse a new one, unlike certain Doctor Stranges I could name. Steven. So how did Jane Foster get this particular version of Mjolnir, and where did it come from? Well, there are a couple of possibilities, but let's start by talking about her comic book backstory. In the comics, Jane Foster became the mighty Thor after Thor Odinson proved himself unworthy of wielding Mjolnir during the original Sin storyline. The hammer telepathically called out to Jane, who it deemed worthy of wielding it, and when she finally picked it up, it transformed her into the God of Thunder. Now, major spoilers for those who have not read the Thor God of Thunder or Mighty Thor comics. But while this was happening, Jane was dealing with a breast cancer diagnosis. And although Mjolnir gave her incredible godlike powers, it also purged her body of what it perceived as toxins, including her chemotherapy drugs. This meant that every time Jane turned into the mighty Thor, she brought herself one step closer to dying from cancer. And it wound up being an incredibly powerful, moving storyline, and I, for one, am still holding out hope they'll do a version of it in the MCU at some point. But with that said, let's get back to the question at hand. What if this Jane is actually a variant? Now, it's certainly possible given the MCU's current focus on the multiverse. Case in point, the events of Loki firmly established the concept of variants, the possibility of branch timelines, and the fact that the Time Variance Authority is no longer equipped to prune timelines after He Who Remains was turned into remains by Sylvie's dagger. So consider this, perhaps the destruction of Mjolnir by Hela was a Nexus event in the MCU. It's another concept that Loki took great pains to establish. For those who don't remember, a Nexus event is an event that caused the sacred timeline to diverge and create a branch reality. Typically, the TVA would send their agents to prune these branch timelines before they got too far and led to the multiverse rearing its ugly head, but now they are well and truly out of commission. And while it's unclear if Jane Foster managed to repair Mjolnir herself after it was destroyed or someone else did, this is clearly intended to make us think it's the same hammer that Thor lost in Thor Ragnarok. We know this because shows like Loki establish that Infinity Stones from other realities are basically fancy paperweights when they're removed from their home timeline.
We actually got a lot of those. Yeah, some of the guys use them as paperweights.
What if doubled down on this notion with the Infinity Crusher, a device intended to destroy Infinity Stones, but it turned out to be useless because it was designed for Infinity Stones from its home timeline?
Of course. The Crusher was designed to destroy the stones on my world, not his.
So basically, since Jane is able to use Mjolnir to summon the powers of the God of Thunder, it stands to reason that this version of Mjolnir at least began its life as the one from the main MCU timeline, even if they turn out to be from some kind of time loop reality, kinda like we saw in Avengers Endgame. Now, alternate timelines and multiversal realities also played a very important role in the Thor God of Thunder comics, on which this film is seemingly based. In Thor God of Thunder number 4, Gore the God Butcher murdered the time gods of Kronux and seized control of the Pool of Forevers. He used this to travel through time to enslave and kill other gods to enact his master plan. So perhaps this Jane Foster is a survivor of a reality where Gore murdered Thor and Jane was deemed worthy to wield the reforged version of Mjolnir. Much like we saw multiple versions of Thor through the years at the beginning of this trailer, Gore also went up against multiple versions of Thor across the time-space continuum in his quest to kill every god that ever lived. With that in mind, Thor wouldn't need a reason to be surprised to see Jane Foster as the mighty Thor beyond the fact that he probably views it as identity theft, but the added twist of having Jane be from another timeline would fit in perfectly with the core tenets of Phase 4 thus far. Now, with all of that said, as The Verge pointed out in their Mjolnir theory piece, the hammer that Jane is wielding could also have its roots in 2019's War of the Realms storyline. During that event, Jane Foster wielded a version of Mjolnir that was constantly on the verge of breaking, like, say, literally any item in Breath of the Wild. This Mjolnir was from another universe, and it drove another Thor variant mad. As it turns out, this cursed Mjolnir wasn't actually Mjolnir at all per se, rather it was an aspect assumed by Underjarn, the All-Weapon, a powerful artifact forged from Mjolnir's shards in another reality. Now, as established in Valkyrie Jane Foster number 9, Underjarn could transform into all manner of weapons and devices depending on what the user needed. Basically, it's this magical multi-tool, and integrating a weapon like Underjarn into the MCU could make for a very cool addition to the Thor mythos as well. Now, of course, there is no indication they might be following this particular path. It's just nice to see there's a precedent for a development like this in the comics. While having Jane Foster as a variant wouldn't necessarily preclude them from pursuing the cancer storyline, having Jane as a variant might feel a bit too much like Marvel's going back to the same well as Loki, Spider-Man No Way Home, or the upcoming Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. I mean, look, we're already going to be asking if everybody's a Skrull, but also, are they a variant as well? What's next, Mephisto? And look, this theory could turn out to be a regular Ralph Boner. I'm honestly not entirely convinced myself just yet. There are plenty of other theories floating around out there as well about how the MCU's version of Jane not only got her powers, but acquired that version of Mjolnir. And we'll continue to explore those in the days ahead right here on Nerdist as we count down the days until Thor Love and Thunder hits theaters on July 8th, 2022. Now, in the meantime, folks, tell us, what do you think of this theory? Do you think that Jane Foster is actually a variant? How do you think that Mjolnir was reforged?
I literally pieced it together as I went along.
Let us know in the comments below, and for the latest and greatest in the world of pop culture, stay tuned to Nerdist.com.